Hello listeners and welcome to Pop Screen, part of the Geek Show podcast network. We are that corner of the Geek Show that likes to deal with the good, the bad and the diggable of movies either starring, about or by pop stars. No, the podcast covers such a broad range of musical and cinematic genres, from country and western to science fiction, from hip-hop to documentaries. I'm your host, Graham Williamson. I'm a writer for The Geek Show, as well as Horrified, Byline Times, and We Are Cult. And I'm joined this week by...
Ewan Gledo, hello. Again.
Hello, Ewan. Where can people find you?
They can find me, as ever, on the internet, at places like Twitter at Ewan Gledo. They can find me at Cult Following, Daily Star, Daily Mirror, Clapper, Geek Show, lots of different places on podcasts as well, on Don't Listen to This podcast, all about music and stuff, which me and Graham have just done an episode of on... What did we do it on? I've already forgot. Eels. Eels is beautiful.
Jesus, man.
I've got so much going on, so much, like, the gerbil whirring around in my hamster wheel brain. Man, yeah. We did talk about music, and we're going to talk about music again, I imagine.
We are, yes, because today we are talking about DiG, a documentary by Ondi Timoner about the rivalry between the Dandy Warhols and the Brian Jonestown Massacre. I am obligated legally to describe it as an indie rock version of Amadeus, as every single other article ever published about this film has. Did I pitch this to you, or did you suggest this to me? I can't remember.
You pitched this to me because I think I mentioned to you that I'm very interested in Andy Warhol's work, like the actual Andy Warhol. And it made sense that, Andy Warhol, perfect. And then I kind of went on a deep dive that I've still not recovered from.
Okay.
Yeah. No, it was very good. Because obviously I think I mentioned this to you about 6 months ago, because I mentioned I'd just finished reading Andy Warhol's Popism,
yeah.
Which I really enjoyed. It was really good. Obviously, none of that helps in this instance. Not at all.
In fact, I didn't even realise that was why I said it, even though when you said it, I thought, oh yeah, that was almost certainly the unconscious motivation, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I assume that was the Dandy Warhol's motivation as well, which was assemble themselves and put themselves towards another artist, which is what we all do, really. That's the only way through this mental music business.
I think I latched onto this film's subject matter because I just appreciated finding other people who were as invested in bad puns as I am.
You know what? I didn't know much about Dandy Warhols when he first pitched this to me, and I thought DiG was a documentary referencing the Nick Cave song and album DiG.
DiG Lazarus Dig.
Yeah, and I thought, Nick Cave, all right then. And then you mentioned Dandy Warhols. I'm like, I didn't know Nick Cave was in a band called the Dandy Warhols. That was good. And then I found, much to my shock, that the Dandy Warhols are actually a very, very good alternative rock band.
Yeah, it's a safe assumption to make, given that Nick Cave has a documentary team following him for every moment of his life at the moment, it seems. But
you say that just as Ian Pollard and Jane Forsyth released the Push the Sky Away at 10 documentary. Just another in the endless line of quality Nick Cave content.
Wow. I didn't even know that was a thing. But yeah, Push the Sky Away is great, actually. Oh, yeah. I love that album.
Wonderful.
But yes. Yeah, this is interesting. I remember this movie coming out. I saw this in the cinema when it came out, when it was released in Britain in 2005. And back then, it seemed like it got rave reviews. Everyone loved this film, even though when it was announced, people were like, that is quite a niche subject matter to be going after. And revisiting it, I think time has just made it even more fascinating. That there are things in here that are such a perfect reflection of how this era differs from the age we're in now in both good and bad ways. But
Yeah,
coming to it fresh, Ewan,
yeah.
what did you think of it?
Um, I think just as a sort of before you even get to what the documentary is about, I think it's remarkable that 2,500 hours of footage were cut down and made into something that could be approached for not just fans but a general viewer as well. Because sorry, I don't know
Mm.
if you can hear there's three seagulls on my roof. Well,
It's
not my
good. It's
roof, but
atmospheric.
atmospheric. That's part of the Dandy Warhols new lineup, I imagine. Um, yes, it's really good coming into this as sort of a newcomer because it operates well as sort of a learning tool for the Dandy Warhols and more so Brian Jonestown Massacre, which I'm sure we'll get to, but
Mm.
sort of coming into play with charting two very closely knitted bands and how they sort of separated and how one of them achieved success, one of them didn't. It's an age old tale of music, isn't it? But
Yeah,
seeing it develop and seeing it develop so well under Timoner's direction is that's the quality of this. That's the appeal. You could put any bands there and then have this much footage and get a good narrative out of it, which I imagine was I think it was pretty controversial at the time. Some of the Brian Jonestown Massacre members weren't too pleased with
that is
their
true.
yeah
Yeah. I mean, even Courtney Taylor, the Dandy Warhols lead singer, felt the need to go out when it came out and said about Anton Newcombe, Brian Jonestown Massacre's lead singer, said, "Look, that's not all Anton is. You know,
yeah
they were a bit unfair to him in the edit, and it's unfair, but I don't." I don't obviously have the authority to say whether it's untrue or not, but at some point you have to address the fact that the Brian Jonestown Massacre were a band who were beloved in their little local scene, who never achieved any wider success. And the Dandy Warhols were liked, but not as well regarded as that, and yet they became international pop stars. So you
yes.
have to create in your narrative some sort of explanation of why that happened.
And I suppose the flip side of that as well is that only one of them made "Why You So Crazy," so the other one, in hindsight, it gets off rather lightly. Um,
Yes.
the benefit of hindsight is a beautiful thing, but on the sense of Brian Jonestown Massacre being essentially a riot on stage where the singer is very angry that people are either interrupting him or not understanding his work. 2,500 hours of footage is a lot of footage. You can't just sift through all of that. And I imagine there are
Yeah.
periods where he's quite amicable, he's quite friendly. None of that is shown. And the attitude presented by the sort of hour 45 that has him in the spotlight isn't very flattering, but also is pretty accurate, I'd imagine, to sort of that period of art and making music, which is we're going to conquer the world, we're going to make something that's it's our God given right to make music this good, when actually it's pretty good. It's all right. It's not going to
Yeah, yeah.
open glass, though, is it?
In a strange way, I think it did Newcomb a lot of favours because even though he does come across very badly in some of the footage, when it was released, and this is, one of the ways in which the film is not just a time capsule of the either when it was shot, but also when it was released. But when it was released, a lot of people were like, "Oh, the Dandy Warhols, it just shows them as being corporate sellouts," whereas Anton Newcombe and the Brian Jonestown Massacre were the real geniuses who never got their acknowledgement.
Yes.
And I think a lot of his bad behaviour does fall into that sort of tortured genius stereotype that, I mean, the Brian Jonestown Massacre is still going and they still have a steady fan base. And, every now and then I will see their official Twitter account being quite cool. And, that's nice. So I don't think I can understand why Newcomb would have saw this at the time and just been hopping mad. I get
Yeah.
that completely,
Oh,
but
yeah.
in the long run, it definitely did not harm his career in any way, and may even have benefited it.
I was just about to say they released a new album, Brian Jonestown Massacre, 2 weeks ago, at time of
Right.
recording. It's not as and it's received favorable reviews. People still like Brian Jonestown Massacre, and
Mm.
obviously, I mean, we just spoke about Eels, where they're at a point in their career where they will consistently make decent records for the fans that they've assembled. They're
Yeah.
not going to set the world on fire as they wanted to at the time. that heyday is long gone, and you can kind of see it unraveling over the period of Dig. I think is it 7 years that they sort of put together in Dig,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
it goes from very promising sort of grungy back rooms that they're playing in to literally 10 people, where one of them is
Yeah.
frantically throwing his arms in the air like some sort of. I mean, it reminded me of when I used to go clubbing in Sunderland, where you'd see two people get in straight away and just start flailing their arms in the air because they've dropped all their drugs at once and are just firing into it. And by about 11:30, they're knackered. Um, it was
Listeners,
really,
if you wanted to know whether this is a glamorous picture of rock and roll or not, the fact that Ewan has just compared it to clubbing in Sunderland should tell you everything you need to know.
I remember perfectly what happened because it was Sam Fender's Hypersonic Missiles was playing as they sort of threw their arms out of tune with the rhythm. Um, it was remarkable, but it really did remind me of that period because Dig, for instance, I don't want to speak ill of Sunderland, but Dig has a lot of fighting, a lot of drugs, a lot of horrible people.
Yeah.
Sunderland, the less said about that place, the better. But Dig does a really good job, I think, of getting very in the face. It's the opposite of fly on the wall. It's right
Mm.
buzzing right next to the people that are there. The camera's always up in the action. It's always right and present. It's the not to skip too far into the film, but it's the piece where they're recording the gig and the narration goes, well, somebody started fighting the camera crew and then they started fighting the band. And it's like, yeah, okay, I can see how this is developed. And it kind of it fits in with the image that Brian Jonestown Massacre kind of have for themselves, not just with their name, but with their music, which is,
Mm.
again, that sort of psychedelic rock, the neo-psychedelic phase that the Dandy Warhols had succeeded with, just for whatever reason wasn't as popular. And I feel like the framing of Dig, for instance, gives it the perspective of it failed because of Anton. It failed because of his arrogance and his ego. How true that is, I have no idea. I don't know Brian Jonestown Massacre personally. Never met him. Never had the pleasure.
Mm.
But it really does make the argument that it is him at the core of this that is the problem.
The problem, yeah, and also kind of the solution as
Yeah.
well in a
Yes.
strange way. Like, if this film was being made now as a retrospective documentary, I think there would be more of an emphasis on saying, well, look, Anton didn't need to be so volatile, didn't need to take so many
Yeah.
drugs, didn't need to be so emotionally disturbed in order to make this music, because we are going through a phase where that idea of the tortured genius who treats the people around them like shit is subject to a very sustained backlash. I
Yes.
think if
Yeah.
if this film was made now, probably the hero of it would be his brother Matt, who
Yeah.
looks like the now. I don't even remember people talking that much about Matt when the film came out, but you look at him now and you think, God, he is holding this band together
Yeah.
single-handedly a lot of the time.
He is, and it's those little snapshots you see of him, either in the back of the car, just kind of looming in the background. He looks fed up, but he knows he's not really got a choice. This is his
Mm.
shot at success. He did a solo album a couple of years ago, which by all means was very good. Um, he kind of looks a bit like John Lennon in this film. He's
Yeah,
got like
yeah.
the parting and the glasses, but yeah, he doesn't get enough credit for how much it's held together. And the tambourine player, Joel, is it Joel?
Joel
Um,
Gion. Well,
Joel
he's a
Gion,
star, though, isn't he? He's
star, the man
great.
himself. Um, but what stuck with me is that kind of a lot of Dig presents Brian Jonestown Massacre as somebody needs to step up to the plate so that the band survives this next iteration or this next argument. And
Mm.
Joel is constant with that. He's, it was where they said, oh, he's got an ear infection, he can't come and do the interviews, and Joel steps in.
Yeah,
You kind of see that a lot of the people in Brian Jonestown Massacre are naturals for having those right placements. They know how to brush shoulders with the press and the management labels. They know what they're doing, but are held back by what is, I feel like we should just use allegedly all the time.
yeah, yeah.
Allegedly, Anton's sort of disposition and hatred of everybody that wants to offer him success that he clearly craves. It's,
And in, in,
yeah.
in other circumstances, you could see that as a very healthy relationship, that you've
Oh,
got
yeah.
this brilliant songwriter and multi instrumentalist, but he is not mentally well enough to do certain
No.
things. And
Yeah.
you can understand that. You see him writing a song about how he was abandoned by his parents, that his dad later died by suicide. And you think, yeah, if you're putting that kind of material out in the world, it's probably going to be quite difficult to sit across from some spot asking you where you get all your crazy ideas
Yeah.
from, Um, so that could have been a healthy thing if, the band had been in a comfortable enough place to say, we want to be successful, but Anton cannot do certain parts of the sort of make nice stuff with record labels and journalists.
Yeah.
But fortunately, we've got Matt and Joel, and they're just naturals at that. So let's
Yeah.
send them out. But the fact that Anton wants such a level of control over the band means that division of labour only happens when there's a massive crisis.
Yes, and it's towards the latter end of the documentary when he's like, "We're going to go and pawn one of my guitars. We're going to do a double page spread cover shoot." And
Mm,
it's the ego of the artist that always kind of it's the double edged sword of it's really entertaining and really interesting to see how that develops. On the other hand, it's kind of up in the clouds. It's not really connected to what the reality of the band is. A lot of those mistakes are made throughout Dig, and I feel like they're the real interesting perspectives that
mm.
that when they all move into a house together, it's the idea behind it. We'll all live in the same place. We'll make music, and they did make
Yeah,
albums while they were there. The contrast of that is you have a lot of people that suffered from drug abuse, alcohol abuse, all under one roof, saying, "Oh, should we throw a party? Yeah, go on then."
yeah,
And it's a recipe for disaster, as overplayed as that term is. It quite literally is. Um, and it's amazing how much of it is kind of documented. And I think the big contrast is obviously the documentary makers were invited to the Brian Jonestown Massacre party, and it's like, oh, we can't go. We're at a Dandy Warhols party instead.
yes, yeah. And Timoner is a really interesting filmmaker, I think. I
Yeah,
don't like all of her films, but I think she's made some that are as good as any documentarian of her generation. I
yeah,
think her most interesting characteristic, which sometimes lets her down, is that she is she has a need to make films about magnetic, charismatic subjects. She sort of thinks that once you put that into position, the documentary will work because of them. And sometimes that backfires. I guess what I'm saying is, yes, she has made a film about Russell Brand, unfortunately. Um, but
uh,
I think when it works, it works. I think her best film is We Live in Public, which is about her own kind of personal relationship to someone who had that kind of mad guru personality and turned out to be sort of more, but also sort of less than what he was presenting himself as. And that's really good because it gives you a sense of where what need in her is being filled by this. But it feeds into Dig as well, because one of the things that I think is most flattering to Newcomb in this film is that the idea that he is a genius is never challenged. Even when
yeah,
he's getting into fights on stage, even when he's screaming at his girlfriend, even when there's this one ridiculous moment where Courtney Taylor's voiceover says, Anton had started using heroin heavily as he was about to start making his most important album yet. And you
yeah.
think, yeah, there's your problem. But
It
it never questions the idea that he is doing this because he is a genius.
Yeah, and it always that the drug aspect there. It always reminds me of the interview Neil Young gave, where he essentially said the more the drug use went up, the productivity of music making went down. It was
Yeah,
cross parallels, and you never get the implication or even the sort of showcase of anybody actively saying to Anton, "I don't think this will help."
yeah,
Also, I don't think you're a genius as you say you are. Which is interesting to some degree because it's kind of as a documentarian, I feel like there is not me. I'm not saying I'm a documentarian. I'm saying as in like Timona.
from her
Um,
point of view, yeah.
from her perspective, it's to meddle with that is to meddle with what she's displaying and what she's showing, and I
Mm,
respect that. On the other hand, she should have just kind of nudged someone and gone, somebody
have a
needs to have a
word.
word. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's and I guess we can't argue with the sort of quality that came from that period as well, because obviously they did the Satanic Majesty's Second Request, and then Give It Back, Strung Out in Heaven. They were productive,
Yeah.
And these albums were very good for what was at the time a very disruptive period. I'm not championing what he was doing, because what he was doing was clearly stupid, but it's 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 the egomania of it, and I think Timoner does a really good job of kind of just letting that glide through. It's very difficult to feel anything but kind of sympathy for Anton. It's like,
Yeah.
I'm a genius, I'm an artist, and it's like, yeah, okay, technically, yeah. How about you just sort of wind it down a little bit, because you are not going to sort of disrupt the world if you keep fighting your audience.
Yeah, and I think that's part of where her sort of fascination with these figures really pays off, and the fact that that fascination is so personal and it draws from her own life. She's making a film about her dad at the moment. Her dad
Oh,
was terminally ill a bit back, and I would be fascinated to see if Timona Senior has any sort of relationship with these sort of charismatic figures who expect the world to step aside from them, or whether he's a
yeah,
completely different guy. But you're right that anyone else would have said, we need to calm Anton down. But Timona is entranced by this behaviour, and when she's
yeah,
entranced by this behaviour in a subject like Russell Brand or Bjorn Lomborg, that becomes a problem, because you want someone to tell them to shut the fuck up. But in this instance, it means that she can hang on and just stay with Anton at a time when
yeah,
he is alienating people who've known him since childhood. But Timona is still right there with the camera because she can hang on in that
yeah.
situation.
It's the sort of I can't think of any specific examples, but every artist is assumedly quite egotistical and has started pushing people away for the sake of
Mm.
their creativity, and it's shown really well here. And it's as it goes on, he gets more insufferable, and
Yes.
it's that kind of the egomania of it is, it turns from really fascinating and interesting to, oh my god, please just somebody say something to him, just
Yeah.
tell him to like just get a grip. But I feel like that is so well done and so well drawn out, because it would have been very easy for Timona to just go, here's an hour and 40 minutes of a guy just saying he's the musical equivalent of Christ and not
Yeah.
actually making any music. um but it does get to the real core of Brian Jonestown Massacre, which is the sort of, at some stage, it was when they were doing the photo shoot on the mountain, and somebody comes up and says, "Are you a cult? Or are you a band? What's going on?" And they're like, "We really don't know at this point. We have no idea." And I feel like that's a really good way of sort of demonstrating what happened to Brian Jonestown Massacre, especially in that period where they were trying to be the next big thing. They were really convinced by their own abilities, and rightly so, because I mean, history has shown and the
Because they're
discography has
good.
shown they
Yeah.
are good.
Yeah.
And it's really just, it's a warning sign for artists who think they're bigger than they actually are.
Yeah, Miranda Lee Richards, the singer-songwriter who's present for a lot of the later stages of the film, has that killer line where she says, all these famous 60s bands got into drugs, but they were famous first.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
that is sort of the problem,
yeah,
isn't it? The cruel truth is that if you develop a serious drug habit when there are people around you who need you to make an album for their fourth quarter earnings to hold up, they will move heaven and earth to make sure you can do
yes.
all of the whacked out creative ideas you want. But when you're doing it as an unsigned band, what you're doing there is just having a drug problem.
Yeah, exactly that. And it's weird how that lens changes, though.
Mm,
We think of so many. I mean, Nick Cave's probably the best example for sort of the drug addiction and how it charted through his music. Wouldn't have been the same story had he not already established his success with the birthday party and with his early albums.
mm,
Brian Jonestown Massacre, for me, over and over again, they did deserve more success than they got. I think that's a given. But they appear to have succeeded in their own minds. They've
mm.
gone, well, we've made albums, they're very good, they've been well received. Why haven't we been signed yet? Let's just skip that section and move to the bit where we become jaded and make albums that are very raw and
Yes.
struggle. Um, which is a weird way of going about it, and clearly didn't succeed. But it's, again, it links back to Anton as the core, because you look at the other members of Brian Jonestown Massacre, most of them have released solo albums, one or two.
Yeah.
Joel Gion, for instance, did Apple Bonkers, which is, I think about 70 people listen to it, but he
I'm
got...
fascinated as to what the solo album by the tambourinist from the Brian Jonestown Massacre sounds like.
Oh, yeah, it's exactly what you'd expect of a man with Gaz Coombs sideburns down to here and a tambourine. But again, it's the fact that I think regardless of whether or not art succeeds, I think the fundamental of creating something that people can listen to and will listen to
Mm,
is about 80% of the take. I feel like Brian Jonestown Massacre are at times presenting themselves as, well, we're doing something creative, we're doing something unique, and that is fine for us.
yeah,
And then they see the Dandy Warhols and how successful they got and go, hang on a second, why aren't we at that level? We are as good, if not better than them, and are doing more than them, and are doing this and that and the other. That's just not how it works. Sometimes it's, hard cheese.
yeah. And I think that this is part of why I think, for all the film was really highly acclaimed when it came out, it was highly acclaimed for the wrong reasons in a lot
Yeah.
of ways. There was an attitude that this is a film about what happens when a bunch of real artists get leapfrogged by a bunch of commercial sellouts. And it's like, I mean, again, as we were saying with Eels, the traditional record industry, the super labels are now so weakened that there isn't really that stigma to selling out. You are at best selling to something slightly bigger than what you'd get otherwise,
Yeah.
which, but I think looking back at it, you can say that the Dandy Warhols were perfectly sensible to look at this sound, to look at this scene, to look at what was developing and say, right, the best thing we can do with this is to get an international hit and tour regularly. Because the Brian Jonestown massacre and the Dandies in their early days both seem to think this is a revolution going on. This is going to change music. And in retrospect, that there was a lot of really exciting forward-thinking music being made in the 1990s, but the stuff that lasted and had an impact was not the stuff made by a bunch of people trying to sound like the Silver Apples.
Yeah.
It's too retro to have the impact they want it to.
It's I think any artist has that sort of format to the work where it's, I'm making the next big thing. I feel
Mm.
like that's a fundamental belief that needs to be part of making a record. Why make a record if you don't think you're, setting
Yeah,
the earth
yeah.
ablaze? But there are layers to that. There are levels to how acceptable it can be. Um,
Mm.
for the Dandy Warhols, at least they kind of realized early on in this documentary, it's like, we've just got to, rein it in a bit and follow the pattern that has worked so well. The revolution
Mm.
can wait. Brian Jonestown Massacre's revolution is kind of very self-destructive because they feel like entitled to it almost. They feel like they're entitled to this structure of explosive music and pushing through as the next big thing. The mid 90s was not a time for neo psychedelica. I feel like they may have,
Certainly not in America.
not in America, no. They may have missed the boat. I think Cream had covered that a couple years before,
Mm.
but better late than never. And I feel like the documentary makes the point very early on, or it might have been a review I read. I'm not too sure which one it was, but it was, there's very limited success you can make in an album or a band that references an artist that came before it. You
Yeah,
know, Brian Jonestown Massacre obviously mentioned Rolling Stone, the Brian Jonestown Massacre as well, and Dandy Warhol's Andy Warhol.
yeah.
It's difficult to cement a unique voice when you are trying to refer to yourselves as something that has passed, which is an uphill struggle, but it can be done, as Dandy Warhols did. Whether or not it was a revolution, and I feel like that feeds into Dig as a sort of angling itself on, these people genuinely believe that they are at the core of something that's going to explode. Obviously, it didn't, and in hindsight, it looks a bit embarrassing.
Mm.
it's very hard to sort of keep agreeing and nodding along with Anton or even the Dandies as well when they're going, this music's going to change the world. It's like, yeah, yeah, sure, okay, right. That's
Yeah,
good for you. Um, yeah, it's
it
difficult to sort
changed
of
the world 30 years ago, but I think expecting it to do exactly the same thing twice is a bit. But I think, again, that's part of where Timoner is able to be quite hands off with that, because I think another documentarian, even if they didn't step in and say, oh, come on, would
yeah,
cut that so it appeared consciously ridiculous and we were
yeah,
meant to laugh at these people wanting to change the world. Whereas part of the beauty of Dig and part of the reason why it connects so well as a piece of storytelling is that for the first half of this, you are swept along. You do think,
yeah.
yeah, go out there,
Oh yeah.
change the world.
I think that's the most important thing is that Dig doesn't challenge that, and obviously later on it causes a few problems. But at the start of it, it is, as any good movement, it begins with kind of just a real desire to change something. That's how all revolutionary pieces of music happen. There is a real desire, and it feels genuine. I think that's the key. Is that I'm not laughing at Brian Jonestown or Dandy Warhols because I'm actually kind of hoping for them to do something because they are good musicians,
Yeah,
and any artist that doesn't sort of cement themselves as I'm going to really push for something new, I'm going to be the center of a real creative storm. That's just passion, I think, and it's shown really well in Dig, where I think it's the New Year countdown. Moments like that just feel nice and rounded and rewarding, and you
yeah,
can see why they think they're going to be the next big thing. You can see why Brian Jonestown Massacre, for a long period of time, thought we're actually doing something here that's going to be really good. And then in hindsight, you look at something like Her Majesty's Second Request, and it kind of just looks a bit like what the Rudels did with Eric Idle, um, which is a bold move, not a good idea.
yeah,
But I think it's one of those artists that kind of it's always with the benefit of hindsight that we look back at their just not just the Dandies but Brian Jonestown as well, where their discography is really strong. It
yeah,
wasn't ahead of the time because that time had already passed, but what they were doing at the time, while it wasn't the popular genre, the scene, is very very strong work. And it's
yeah.
kind of it's a shame that they never got the success. But then you look at the latter half of the documentary and think, what would have happened if they did? What would have
Yeah,
happened?
I think part of the moral of this film is be careful when you say you don't want to be a careerist because you might end up without a career.
Yeah, it's the fine line, isn't it, between an artist trying to keep their artistic integrity and
And an
obviously,
artist just throwing opportunities
yeah,
away. Yeah.
because I feel like as much as the Dandy Warhols kind of dropped off a bit in their
Mm.
later releases, they did manage to keep that integrity. They've managed to keep it going on for the better half of almost 3 decades now. 94, 2004.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
And
been a
in a
long while.
strange way, you mentioned being ahead of their time. I mean, in a strange way, they were, because there is a mention late on in this film of the Strokes and the White Stripes, who
Yes,
were
yeah,
the big rock bands around the time this film was released. And you think, well, the Dandy Warhols were making that kind of garage rock back in the mid to late 90s. And as
yeah,
soon as those bands hit big, they started making songs like You Were the Last High, which are obviously going in a different, more kind of synth led direction.
yeah.
Which, surprise, surprise, by the end of the decade, a lot of those bands like the Strokes and the Yeah, Yeah, Yeahs were doing themselves. So, for all they don't have the sort of maverick genius kind of cachet of the Brian Jonestown Massacre, they did manage to stay a step or two ahead of the trends in their genre, and that's more than most bands ever manage.
Exactly. And it's yeah, that's exactly what they did. And it's especially, I mean, if we look at the recent releases of the Dandies and Brian Jonestown. Brian Jonestown obviously did an album literally 2 weeks ago. It was
Was it
fairly
their
good.
first release of the year, or have they already done 6 other albums?
So this is their first release of the year, but apparently their Peel sessions from '98 are coming out too.
Okay.
Um, and then you look at the Dandies who haven't released anything since 2019, and rightly so. It's it's interesting to see that it's kind of flipped a little bit. Dandies, while they had massive success, they played Reading, they do massive tours, and it's like you mentioned earlier, they knew that was what they needed to do. You get a
Mm.
big hit and then you go on tour. You get a big hit and you go on tour until
Yeah.
you've established yourself. Brian Jonestown want to skip that part, and I can see why, because that's really the early days of an artist are never quite as interesting as what they get up to further on down the line. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, it's Dandy Warhols. I'm still certain that they're good, but not enough of it is shown in Dig. I don't think we get much perspective on what they were doing beyond. Oh, we're doing really well, thank you. Thanks for checking in. Anyways, we're off to meet Smashing Pumpkins. Um, instead, obviously, the focus is on Brian Jonestown, and a lot of it then becomes like, you know what? It never feels desperate. It never feels like Brian Jonestown are hitting their limit or hitting a wall of sort of, oh my god, this might be it. This might be the end. All of them have such a defiance to them, where it's like, this is what's going to make us big next, and then they don't learn from that past and just go, this is what's going to make us big now. This is what we need to do.
Yeah,
Um,
rather than Amadeus,
yeah,
it's Augie March, isn't it? It's the guy just running down the street going, I got a scheme, I got a new
it's
plan.
exactly that, and it's almost weekly that they do that through
Yeah.
Dig. It's like the documentary team just show up and go, all right, well, what's Anton up to today? It's like, oh, you don't want to know. It's like, why not? It's like he thinks it'll be the next big thing. It's like, it could be, and it's that belief though I think is really important to artists. And I mean, massive credit to Anton and Brian Jonestown Massacre for not having that extinguish.
Yeah.
They got hit pretty hard and quite frequently throughout Dig, and that's a 7 year period of just seeing an album after album release, and an artist kind of getting frustrated with moderate success. And I feel like that success in hindsight is very, very good, because you look at how many albums shift now compared to how it used to.
Yeah.
You look at the contrast there. Brian Jonestown Massacre today would be a massive success.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
you
Yeah.
know, it's but it's a matter of like, I don't know. Do you think if I know we just mentioned there Brian Jonestown Massacre, if they were doing what they did now, would be a success? Do you think that would be the case?
I don't know. I think there is like a window now for that retro revivalist rock, largely because it's
Yeah,
so different to what's in the mainstream. Like at the time that there is a bit of talk about how alienated these bands are from the American mainstream. Like Courtney Taylor says when Bohemian Like You came out, he says, "Oh, we put out a garage rock record in the boy band era, and it became a big hit." And you think, all right, but that's an American perspective. Britain
yeah,
had boy bands, yes, but our mid to late 90s were also defined by Britpop, which actually makes it a very good time to put out a 60s style garage rock
yeah,
record. So I think nowadays, if a new band was doing this,
yeah.
they would probably have the success of someone like Clairo, where they're not
Oh, yeah,
massive, but Clairo has a similar kind of retro singer-songwritery appeal, and people really connect with that because it's not like anything that's in the charts.
yes. And I mean, obviously, you mentioned there Britain had that Britpop phase.
Yeah,
It kind of makes sense that the Dandy Warhols then sort of began to reposition themselves in the UK. They did Reading, they started releasing more work over there, did UK
yeah,
tours, and that's something that's kept with them still, that they still do UK tours. I think the most recent tour they did was of the UK and Northern Ireland and, around that area and a bit of Europe. And I think that's because, retrospectively, a lot of music in the 90s did feel like the 60s in England. In
yeah.
America, it was very different because you had sort of the petering out of grunge and then the uptake of people like Green Day and the sort of, I don't know what the genre for that is, but I've always just put it under embarrassing emo pop that is kind of fun to listen to sometimes. Um, and it's that schism. Both bands were offered the opportunity to do that. One of them took it and kind of became the sellouts, but sellout is just another word for successful. And the
Yeah.
other ones just kind of began flailing around in their own shit, which is not a place you want to be, but it's kind of that love hate system, isn't it? It's they wanted success without having to jump through the hoops that mention success.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because in a lot of ways, the revolution that Anton's talking about in the late stage of the film, when they've had a bit of that, oh, we're going to put out the record and it'll sell, millions worldwide, knocked
Yeah,
out of them. The revolution he's talking about sounds a lot like the status quo now. If he
Yeah.
wants to go up to a mountaintop over LA with some of his friends and dress up like a cult and make a music video without anyone at the record label saying, "Oh, it's not a bad idea, but we want to get this guy in to direct it." Yeah, every artist can do that now, but it doesn't feel like as much of a liberation as I think Anton Newcombe expected it to be.
Yes, there's only so far you can get when you're introduced in a documentary dressed up almost like George Harrison and playing a sitar. So there's only
Yes.
so far you can take certain images, and fair enough. They try to persevere with an image that worked for them. It
Mm,
doesn't work for the audience. Is the key. I mean, you look
yeah.
at all the best musicians that we can sort of think of solo wise: David Bowie, Prince, always changing their image, or alternatively, people like Bob Dylan changing their sound and
Yeah.
what their lyrics are about. And you can always get certain success, but you can see that charted through Dandy Warhol's releases, where they start going, like you mentioned, they started just before the Smiths, not the Smiths, the Strokes, just before the Strokes, and then they start shifting to synth, and they're always kind of on the right curve, but not popular enough to be seen as the front runners for it, which is
Yeah.
unfortunate, but it's a better place to be than where Brian Jonestown Massacre found themselves, which was an initially very strong sound that failed to keep up, which is a
Yeah.
shame. But
And that's the other sort of part of it that I think is kind of a Faustian bargain. In that, let's say that Anton Newcombe gets exactly what he wants. Let's say their Satanic Majesty's Second Request comes out and is the biggest selling album internationally that year.
yeah,
What do you do then? How do you capitalize on that without being part of this record industry that you hate? The only path you have open to you is to do what the Dandy Warhols did, which is to sign to a bigger label, get
yeah,
some fashion photographers in to direct your videos, allow your songs to be used on adverts, go and do Reading Festival.
yeah.
You need some sort of infrastructure to be able to make that success sustainable. How are you going to do a worldwide tour without an album? Are you just going to pack your guitar in a little travel case and fly around the world? It's a completely unworkable idea.
I feel like obviously we've got the benefit of not being musicians, but I've
Mm,
never really understood that whole. Oh, we're gonna do this independently. We're gonna do it in our own vision. We're gonna do it on our own terms. Like that's not how it works. It just isn't.
yeah,
There's no, and I'm all for sort of rattling against the system, but that's just plain and simply not how it works. You can't just
it
pick
is.
up your
It is
guitar
quite
and head off.
nice to have people there who understand the business side of it,
Yeah,
isn't it? When you're creating something, I don't really want to have to think about, whether it's going to affect my fourth quarter earnings or not. And
yeah,
I think, the internet revolution has given us a taste, all a small taste of what it's like to be your own bank manager. And it fucking sucks. It's
oh yeah.
terrible. No one should ever go through this.
It's horrible. I filled out a tax return for the first time this year.
I know.
I,
Yes.
Horrifying. Really, really soul destroying. And I never thought, oh, me interviewing Richard Hall is going to really tap into my business earnings. It's like, that's not what I did this for.
No.
Why? But it's part and parcel of what happens when you get successful. I'm not saying I'm successful, I mean, in the sense of Dandy Warhols and Brian Jonestown Massacre.
Mm,
To hit the next level, you've just kind of got to accept that there is a commercial viability to your work.
yeah.
Um, I've never understood the integrity of not selling my work to commercials or stuff like that. It's like you never know when the hard times are going to hit. I would take the money and run as you had it perfectly put in one of their songs.
Yeah.
It's I always remember Elvis Costello um sold Pump It Up to a car company. I think it was Nissan. And they
Mm,
would play it over and over again, just pump it up over and over again. It's like I can't listen to that song anymore without thinking of a Nissan. But he's got that many other songs, and he's kind of earned the chance to sell off his music. It's that we had a big period last year where the likes of, I think it was Bob Dylan, Paul Simon, Bruce Springsteen sold all of their music to Sony. They sold the rights to it.
yeah.
At some point, an artist hits what they can do with that music. They hit a point where they go, "All right, now's the time to cash out." And there's nothing wrong with that. And I feel like Brian Jonestown Massacre would genuinely have been more successful if they'd held up their hands and gone, "Okay, we are geniuses. We have all the artistic functions that are needed to make a great album. But to get it out there so that more people can understand that genius, you've got to have a record label. You've got to have
Yeah.
somebody to push it through. I mean, if we think contemporary times, the only independent artist currently is the Ratons, who hit the charts, topped it, and are shit. But people like Arctic Monkeys ripoffs that go on about tits and Zoo magazine eras. So there you go. That's what people like these days. It's the Strongbow Dark Fruits, I used to read nuts sort of sentimentality.
Finally, a 2007 revival. We've waited so long.
You know, when I wake up in the morning every day before I even have breakfast or think of what I'm going to do, I always just pray that somebody is going to make whatever people say I am. That's what I'm not, but make it worse. That's all I want. And the ratings have done that twice now, and they've topped the charts because we're so sapped of unique independent releases, and people just don't pay
Yes.
attention to stuff like Brian Jonestown Massacre, whose contemporaries would essentially be anything that's released and not had much chart success.
Mm.
Something like The Wave, which is great. People will hear what they want to hear, and I think a lot of music, regardless of, I feel like that people think that the sacrifice of signing onto a label is that you sacrifice creativity, and you don't. Brian Jonestown Massacre seem to have got it into their heads that if they had gone through the avenues of the Dandy Warhols, not only would they be nowhere close to the success that they had envisioned, but they would not have the self-respect. And the latter part I understand to some degree because they were that defiant with what they were trying to do. But they hit wall after wall after wall, and I don't know if it's arrogance or just plain belief in the self that after all the drink, the drugs, the setbacks, the however many members that band has now had, that they are
Joel Giam
still.
claims in this documentary to have been fired from the band 21 times, which gives you a sort of picture as to how this goes.
I feel like it reminds me of Football Manager, where you go into a club that's just an absolute state. Everybody's fallen out. You need somebody at the helm to bring everybody together and to sort of
Yeah.
settle it, because Brian Jonestown Massacre is a massacre. It really was. Just if you look into like the history of the band, who was fighting, who was there, the punch-ups, the fallouts. I mean, very early on in this, you see Anton start decking the guitarist that they'd hired for the evening.
With the immortal line, "You fucking broke my
Fucking
sitar,
broke my
motherfucker,"
sitar.
which I think is one of the film's greatest
It's
legacies.
Oh yeah, but I think that especially highlights the state of the band. There was an immature aspect to it that is kind of funny, but also in hindsight, not what commercialized artists want. You know,
Yeah.
if a record label sees you perform and what they see is three very good songs, and then you beating up a guest session musician, maybe scuppering the record deal there a little bit.
Yeah, it's also not going to start the revolution, isn't it? You know,
No,
unless
no.
the guitarist you're beating up is King Charles III, in which case it would have some lasting constitutional.
I'd love to take a guitar to his head. Not going to say if I mean King Charles or Anton, but I'm sure we can get to the grasp of that.
Just imagine him trying to play guitar with his little gouty chipolata fingers
He can
now.
hold a really good C chord, at least he can just firm the notes down.
It would be like that early Manic Street Preachers performance where they accidentally put Richie's guitar up in the mixing.
I think, apart from that performance, the best live performance I've ever seen is Sean Ryder doing Dare when he's quite clearly off his tits. He's so drugged up. He's got sunglasses on and he's going like this the whole way through. And he's like just shoving his body upwards like he's trying to take off like a rocket. And the very straight faced singer he's performing with is just so embarrassed, but it is just a testament to her professionalism that she powers on through. But you get that feeling with every Brian Jonestown performance. You get every aspect of their performance. When will it end in a fight?
Yeah,
That's not good for somebody like me who's claustrophobic and just kind of wants a good time at music, you know. But
yeah.
there has to be sort of a sense of. I'm amazed there's no breaking point, is what strikes me with DiG. Is that for 7 years they tried doing the same thing, clearly saw it didn't work, and just thought, well, maybe nobody was paying attention, we should do it again. And it's amazing that people can dedicate themselves like that. That actually stuns me.
That's the admirable bit, though, isn't it? Because it's like what we were
Oh
going
yeah,
through on that "Don't Listen to This" podcast episode about eels. One of the things that really cements a band's fandom nowadays is if they have just been driving away on the same furrow for about 20 years.
yeah,
People just naturally sort of fall in love a bit with that, and I don't know what social pressure it's reacting to. It seems to me almost like it would be easier to do now in this society, which is
yeah.
so angled towards retro things and enjoying things from the past, than it would be to do it in the 90s or the 70s or any other time. But for some reason, people just seem to click with bands who have a nice big back catalogue to explore, particularly rock bands.
Definitely. I feel like that's the appeal of Brian Jonestown. Like I've listened to a couple of their records, but I know I've got so much more to get through, and most of it looks pretty good, or at least very relevant in the sense of what it's criticizing or what it's talking about. Like Who Killed
Mm,
Sergeant Pepper just looks like a lot of fun.
yeah,
On the flip side of that, you do get to a point. I mean, I suppose that's the benefit Brian Jonestown had of all that early, well, success technically, but also a rejection of what would have made them as big as Dandy Warhols. If you look at Dandy Warhol's discography, it's a lot shorter and a lot less quality. Um,
yeah,
Obviously, Dandy's Rule OK and the Dandy Warhols Come Down are great albums, really, really fun. On the flip side of that is Distortland and Why You So Crazy. Um, and Why You So Crazy is that sort of, we've been put through the ringer of the commercial machine. We're getting releases now because of loyalty more than anything.
yeah.
We've been through the system, we've released our best works, and are now on the downturn. That's what happens when people make songs like Motor City Street. But Brian Jonestown Massacre hasn't been put through that system. They haven't been put through the stress of the finances and, oh, this album didn't perform well, so therefore your next album will be a bit shorter, type of thing. And it's, there's no winners in Dig. There's no winners by the end of it because you're looking at two very fractured groups who one of them has hit big success and the other one is not so successful. If you look at them now today, one of them's released an album recently, one of them's been dormant for about 5 years. So whoever wins that one is kind of us.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah,
Yeah.
we win because we got this very, very good film out of it.
Yeah. I feel like as far as documentaries go for music especially, this one feels like very very in the moment. It's very
Mm.
kind of, it's not shying away from stuff that sort of, bigger released films would have. Shut Up and Play the Hits, the Pulp documentary, Nick Cave's documentary, all of those are
Well, they're
bigger.
retrospective
They're
films, aren't
retrospective,
they?
yes.
Which that was how things kind of swung starting in
Yeah.
the 2000s, that you got this huge market for documentaries that took a look back at the career of someone who'd been going for decades. But some of those documentaries were great, but
Yeah.
what you lost was the don't look backs,
That's it.
the
Yeah. Don't
the
Look Back.
gimme
Yeah.
shelters, things like that.
It's the sort of haze of being in the moment as well. It's that kind of,
Mm,
for Dig, it feels very grisly and very kind of crusty almost, where it's like handheld cameras. You're really intimate with the band, and it feels all
yeah.
very independent. Contrast to what releases now, which is very recyclable pop documentaries on big artists like Selena Gomez or Taylor Swift, for instance, which are very feeling like they're staged, but are probably not. But because of the
Mm,
sleekness to it and the contrast that
yes.
form through it,
Yeah.
feel very direct and very, this is what the artist wants to represent. Dig is just what the filmmaker wants to do with a lot of footage.
Yeah, I mean, for all we've been rightly sort of praising Anton Newcomb's persistence, you have to sort of
Yeah,
applaud Ondi Timoner for spending 7 years of her life filming two bands who, when she started, were not famous.
yeah.
That is an extraordinary gamble to just assume that'll pay off at some point.
I feel like that's a testament to Warner though, because every good bit of music journalism depends on that blind leap of faith and latching onto a
Yeah,
band that become big. I've been a music journalist for 2 years now, and I'm kind of like, just getting my claws into people that I think are going to sort of jet off, and then I'll
yeah,
sort of grip to the back of that plane. I feel
yeah,
like fundamentally there is a perspective of the person documenting these people wants to be on that same level of notability, and also work-wise, they want to be recognised for what they've done. And I feel like Timoner strikes that really well with DiG. I'm not saying that DiG is better than the Dandy Warhols' albums, the Brian Jones Massacre's albums, but there is the perspective of, you know, making a documentary on these two albums, these two artists, is for the purpose of documenting them for the wider world, whether or not they get successful. It just so
Yeah.
happens to be very helpful that they did.
Yeah.
Very handy. Very, very handy.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, I mean, I don't think the final test of a music film is whether you can show it to a non-fan of the band and
Yeah.
have them like it, but when it happens, it is really nice. And this is definitely a film that you do not have to be
Oh, yeah.
interested in either of the bands to enjoy it.
The key to that is that it's documenting the people that comprise the band rather
Yeah,
than the band. So you're seeing all like the warts and all approach, but it's not at the sort of, you're not getting interjections of their songs playing over. It's like, and then we did this, and it was all very wonderful. You're getting just the core of being really deep in the system. You're seeing
you're
the
not
people
getting the
that are,
bit where Dave Grohl comes on and says, "You've got to remember, at the time, no one had ever heard anything like this."
yes, and Dave Grohl in saying that would be very wrong, but yeah, it all flows very naturally, and I think if you can pull out a very natural flow from 2,500 hours of documentary footage, then you've done something really right. It really is incredible how she managed to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's as good a point as any to leave off, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So if you donate to our Patreon, you'll get a bonus episode of this show every month. I think the next one is probably going to be .com for Murder, starring Huey Lewis and Roger Daltrey. So you know that's going to be good.
Oh no, yeah, brilliant.
But our next free episode will be a rather better Roger Daltrey starring film. It will be Tommy by The Who. So that'll be out in a fortnight. And until then, I've been Graham,
I've been Ewan.
and we'll see you later.